In the heavy grey of a windless morning, a wealthy man with a hard face parks a black sedan beside a deep, silent river. In the trunk, two 8-year-old twins sleep embraced among toys and family photos, surrounded by heavy stones. The trunk is carried calmly to the edge of the murky waters. A few meters away, a white horse stomps on the wet ground, sniffing the air, uneasy. Without looking back, the father pushes the trunk and watches it disappear. The horse neighs loudly, leaps into the river, and starts to swim. Love animal stories? Then subscribe now so you don't miss a thing. Thanks for being with us. Now, back to the story. The grandfather clock in the foyer of the Hawthorne estate chimed 3 times, its somber tone echoing through the cavernous mansion nestled in the rolling hills of Kentucky bluegrass country. Maxwell Hawthorne stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, watching rain cascade down the glass in rivulets that distorted the view of his prized thoroughbred stables. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the crystal tumbler of bourbon. He'd barely touched. "Mr. Hawthorne?" The gentle voice of Mrs. Fletcher, the night nurse, broke his trance. "The twins are asking for you. They're having a difficult evening." Maxwell nodded without turning. "I'll be there in a moment." When Mrs. Fletcher's footsteps faded, he downed the bourbon in one burning gulp and pressed his forehead against the cool glass. Outside, through the curtain of rain, a ghostly white figure moved in the gathering dusk. Paladin, the albino thoroughbred that had once been his racing pride, now retired to the paddock nearest the house. The horse stood motionless in the downpour, his pale form luminous against the darkening landscape, his gaze fixed on the east wing of the mansion, where the twins' bedroom windows glowed with soft light. The sight of the horse brought a fresh wave of anguish. Paladin had been a champion, bringing Maxwell wealth and prestige in the racing world. Now, like everything else in Maxwell's life, the horse served as a bitter reminder of how quickly fortune could turn. Maxwell made his way through the sprawling mansion, past original artwork and antiques that had once signified his ascent from humble beginnings to one of Kentucky's most successful horse breeders and businessmen. Now these trappings of wealth felt like a mockery, unable to save what truly mattered. The East Wing hallway was dimly lit, leading to a room decorated with hand-painted constellations on the ceiling and walls the color of a summer sky. 8-year-old twins Elijah and Emma lay in adjacent hospital beds that had been disguised with colorful quilts and stuffed animals, a pitiful attempt to normalize the medical equipment that surrounded them. "Daddy," Emma whispered, her voice thin as tissue. Paper. Her once lustrous blonde hair had thinned from the treatments, and dark circles shadowed her blue eyes. "Paladin was watching us again today." Maxwell sat on the edge of her bed, smoothing back her hair. Was he now? Elijah, slightly stronger, today, propped himself up on his elbows. "He stands there all day, Dad. Even when it rains, he's guarding us." "That old horse should be in the stable," Maxwell said, forcing a smile, "but he's always been stubborn." "He knows we're sick," Emma said with the simple certainty of childhood. "He's waiting for us to get better so we can ride him again." Maxwell swallowed hard against the knot in his throat. The twins had developed an inexplicable bond with Paladin from the moment they could toddle into the stables. The temperamental thoroughbred, who allowed few handlers near him, had been gentle as a lamb with the children. Before the diagnosis, Maxwell would often find the twins in Paladin's paddock, reading books while leaning against his white flank, or brushing his mane while chattering about their day. "Tell us about when Paladin won the Kentucky Derby," Elijah requested, the same bedtime story they'd asked for countless times. Maxwell recounted the tale, embellishing details of the magnificent comeback in the final stretch, the roar of the crowd, the roses draped over Paladin's sweaty neck. The twins' eyes grew heavy as his voice wove the familiar narrative, and they drifted to sleep before he reached the winner's circle. Mrs. Fletcher appeared at his side with 2 syringes. "Time for their evening medication," she whispered. Maxwell nodded and slipped out to the hallway where Dr. Brennan waited, his expression grim in the half-light. "The latest test results?" Maxwell asked, though he already knew the answer from the doctor's face. "The experimental treatment isn't producing the results we'd hoped for," Dr. Brennan said quietly. "The disease is progressing faster than we anticipated." "There must be something else we can try," Maxwell insisted, his voice rising despite his effort to stay calm. "Some specialist we haven't consulted, some trial we could get them into." Dr. Brennan placed a steadying hand on Maxwell's shoulder. "We've explored every avenue, Mr. Hawthorne. Boston Children's, Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins. The twins have a rare and aggressive form of the disease. I've reached out to colleagues in Europe, but..." He hesitated. "You need to prepare yourself for the possibility that we're running out of time." Maxwell's legs threatened to give way. He braced himself against the wall, photographs of healthier days blurring in his peripheral vision. The twins on their 5th birthday sitting proudly on Paladin's back, Emma winning a ribbon at her first equestrian show, Elijah laughing as he fed carrots to the foals. "How long?" he managed. "Months, perhaps weeks." The doctor's voice was gentle but unflinching. "I wish I had better news." After Dr. Brennan left, Maxwell stood in the darkened hallway, his world collapsing inward. The mounting medical bills were the least of his concerns, though they had already forced him to sell off most of his breeding stock and mortgage the estate to its limit. It was the helplessness that crushed him, the knowledge that all his money, all his connections, all his desperate prayers couldn't save his children. The sound of hooves on gravel drew him to the window. In the courtyard below, illuminated by security lights, Paladin paced in agitation, his white coat gleaming like a beacon in the night. The horse stopped, raised his head toward the twins' window, and released a long, mournful whinny that seemed to echo Maxwell's own anguish. "He knows," Mrs. Fletcher said softly, appearing beside him. "Animals sense these things." Maxwell couldn't respond. The weight of his children's suffering and his own inadequacy pressed on his chest until he could barely breathe. He had built an empire from nothing, overcome every obstacle in his path, but now faced an enemy he couldn't defeat. Later that night, after Mrs. Fletcher had retired to the guest room down the hall, Maxwell returned to the twins' bedroom. He stood between their beds, watching their labored breathing, listening to the steady beep of monitors. Their faces, once round and flushed with health, were now gaunt and pale, their vitality draining away despite every intervention. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, I can't fix this." A sob rose in his throat, but he choked it back. He couldn't break down, not yet. There were still calls to make, specialists to harass, experimental treatments to research. He would exhaust every possibility, drain every account, sell every possession. Outside, the rain had stopped. Moonlight streamed through the windows, casting silver pools on the floor. Maxwell stepped to the window and looked down. Paladin stood motionless in the courtyard, his white form ethereal in the moonlight, his eyes fixed on the window where Maxwell stood. Man and horse regarded each other, 2 sentinels in the night, keeping watch over the sleeping children. In that moment, something shifted in Maxwell. A dangerous idea began to form, one born of desperation and exhaustion of a father's, love twisted by grief into something unrecognizable. If he couldn't save his children from suffering, perhaps he could save them another way. He pressed his palm against the cool glass, his breath fogging the pain. Below, Paladin pawed the ground nervously, as if sensing the dark turn of Maxwell's thoughts. "It's okay, old friend," Maxwell whispered, though the horse couldn't possibly hear him. "I'll take care of them, I promise." He turned back to his sleeping children, his decision crystallizing with terrible clarity. If medicine couldn't heal them, if money couldn't save them, then perhaps mercy required a father's final act of love to end their suffering before it consumed them completely. The thought, once formed, took root like a poisonous weed. Maxwell returned to his study, where he poured another bourbon with trembling hands. He would need to plan carefully. It would need to look like an accident, and it would need to happen soon, before he lost his nerve. Outside, in the silver-washed Kentucky night, Paladin remained at his post, a silent guardian with eyes that reflected the moon and a heart that sensed the gathering storm. The following days passed in a blur of doctor visits, phone calls, and mounting despair. Maxwell moved through the motions of his life like a man underwater. Sounds muffled, movement slowed, the pressure of grief crushing his chest. He fired his financial advisor when the man suggested selling the estate to cover the mounting medical debts. Maxwell would sooner live in his car than displace the twins from their home. "They're getting worse, aren't they?" Emma asked one afternoon as Maxwell sat by her bed, pretending to read financial reports while actually watching her labored breathing. He looked up, startled by her directness. "What makes you say that, sweetheart?" "I can tell by how everyone looks at us," she said, her fingers absently plucking at the edge of her quilt. "And by how Paladin acts. He never leaves the courtyard now." Maxwell glanced out the window. Sure enough, the white horse stood sentinel below, his coat catching the autumn sunlight like fresh snow. "Maybe he just likes the view," Maxwell offered weakly. Emma shook her head, wise beyond her years. "He's waiting. Animals know things we don't." From the adjacent bed, Elijah spoke up, his voice weaker than it had been the previous day. "Ms. Abernathy at school told us that in some cultures, white animals are spirit guides. Maybe Paladin is preparing to guide us somewhere." Maxwell's blood ran cold at his son's words. "That's enough of that talk," he said more sharply than he intended. "Ms. Abernathy tells too many fanciful stories. You both need to rest and focus on getting stronger." But later, as Maxwell walked the perimeter of the estate in the gathering dusk, Elijah's words haunted him. The idea of his children being guided anywhere by anyone or anything filled him with a rage that had no outlet. He found himself at the paddock fence, where Paladin approached cautiously, nostrils flaring. "What do you know that I don't, old friend?" Maxwell whispered, extending his hand. The horse sniffed his palm but didn't draw closer. Those dark eyes, set in the ghostly white face, seemed to hold judgment. "Don't look at me like that. I'm doing everything I can." But was he? The question gnawed at him as he returned to the house. Dr. Brennan had called that morning with news that the European specialist had also declined to take the twins' case. "Too advanced," he'd said gently. "At this stage, our focus should be on comfort care." Comfort care. The euphemism made Maxwell want to put his fist through a wall. There was no comfort in watching his children waste away, in listening to their breathing grow more labored each day, in counting the increasing doses of morphine required to keep their pain at bay. That night, Maxwell found himself in the estate's library, a room he rarely entered since his wife Sarah's passing 3 years ago. It had been her sanctuary, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a reading nook overlooking the rolling pastures. He poured himself a drink from the cabinet that had remained untouched since her death and settled into her favorite chair. Sarah would have known what to do. She had been the family's moral compass, their emotional center. When Elijah broke, his arm falling from a tree, she had stayed calm while Maxwell panicked. When Emma had night terrors, Sarah knew exactly how to soothe her back to sleep. She would have found strength where Maxwell found only weakness, hope where he saw only despair. "What would you do?" he whispered to the empty room. "How would you bear this?" No answer came, only the ticking of the antique clock and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Outside, a light rain began to fall, pattering against the windows. Maxwell's gaze fell on a leather-bound photo album on the side table. He opened it, his throat tightening at the sight of Sarah's neat handwriting, labeling each photo. The twins' birth, their first steps, family vacations, Sarah's final Christmas, her face thin, but her smile radiant as she watched the twins open presents. And there, toward the end, a photo of the day they'd brought Paladin home. The thoroughbred had been a risky investment, temperamental, difficult to train, but with bloodlines that promised greatness. Sarah had been against the purchase, arguing that the money would be better saved for the twins' education. She changed her mind the moment she saw how the horse responded to the children, lowering his proud head to accept their small hands on his muzzle. "He'll protect them," she'd said, snapping the photo of 5-year-old Elijah and Emma standing. On either side of the magnificent animal, he has an old soul. Maxwell closed the album, a plan solidifying in his mind. The lake at the southern edge of the property. The twins had always loved it there. In the summer, they would picnic on its shores and wade in the shallows. It was a peaceful place, surrounded by weeping willows and frequented by herons and deer. If it had to end, that would be the place. A tragic accident, a father momentarily distracted, a canoe overturned in deep water. The very thought made him physically ill, but the alternative seemed worse, watching his children suffer until the bitter end, their bodies racked with pain, their spirits broken. This way would be quick, merciful. He would join them, of course. He couldn't live with what he'd done, wouldn't want to. The three of them would be with Sarah, free from pain at last. Maxwell's hands trembled as he refilled his glass. Was he actually contemplating this? Had grief and desperation corrupted him so completely? But the image of his children's suffering, projected forward weeks and months, steeled his resolve. He was their father. It was his job to protect them, even from a prolonged and painful departure. He would need to plan carefully, wait for the right moment when Mrs. Fletcher was off duty and no visitors were expected, pack a picnic as if it were a normal outing, a father trying to create one last happy memory with his fading children. Bring the old wooden canoe out of storage. A sudden commotion outside broke into his thoughts. The sound of hooves on gravel, a horse's distressed whinny. Maxwell rushed to the window in time to see Paladin rearing and pacing in the courtyard, his white coat visible even in the darkness. The security lights had triggered, illuminating the horse's agitation. Maxwell hurried outside, worried the noise would wake the twins. "Paladin!" he called, approaching cautiously. "Easy, boy!" The horse snorted, eyes rolling wildly as he pawed the ground. When Maxwell tried to approach, Paladin backed away, tossing his head as if in warning. "What's gotten into you?" Maxwell muttered, trying to edge closer. The horse had never acted this way before, not even during thunderstorms that spooked the other thoroughbreds. From the east wing, a light flicked on. Maxwell glanced up to see Emma's pale face at the window, watching the scene below. He waved, trying to reassure her, then turned back to Paladin. "You're scaring the children," he hissed. "Settle down." As if understanding, the horse stopped his frantic movement. He stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on Maxwell, with an intensity that sent a chill down the man's spine. Then, deliberately, Paladin turned and walked toward the stables, stopping once to look back as if expecting Maxwell to follow. Against his better judgment, Maxwell did. He found the horse standing by the tack room, head lowered to nudge at a weathered steamer trunk that had belonged to Sarah's grandfather. The old trunk had been repurposed as storage for the twins' riding equipment, helmets, boots, and the matching blue vests Sarah had insisted on for safety. "What is it, boy?" Maxwell asked, kneeling to open the trunk. Inside, neatly arranged, were the remnants of happier days. Elijah's first riding helmet with a dinosaur sticker on the back, Emma's pink boots that she'd outgrown the previous year, a coiled lead rope with their initials braided into the end. Beneath these lay a white envelope, yellowed with age. Maxwell's heart stuttered as he recognized Sarah's handwriting. He opened the envelope with trembling fingers, unfolding a letter he'd never seen before. "My dearest Maxwell," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found yourself in a dark place I never wanted you to know." The letter continued, Sarah's voice so clear he could almost hear her speaking the words. She wrote of her own fear when facing death, her concern for how he would cope, her absolute faith in his strength as a father. "You've always been the one to fix everything, to solve every problem," she wrote. "But some things can't be fixed, only endured. Remember that darkness is temporary, but the decisions we make in darkness can cast shadows long after the light returns." Maxwell sat on the stable floor, the letter clutched in his hands, tears streaming down his face. How had she known? How had she sensed that he might someday find himself at this terrible crossroads? "The greatest act of love isn't protecting our children from all pain," her letter concluded. "It's showing them how to find meaning despite it. Be the father I know you are, the one who teaches them courage by showing your own. All my love, always, Sarah." Outside, the rain had stopped. Through the stable doors, Maxwell could see the sky clearing, stars emerging between scattered clouds. Paladin stood in the doorway, his white form silhouetted against the night. "You knew," Maxwell whispered. "Somehow, you knew." The horse nickered softly, then turned and walked back toward the courtyard, his hooves making a steady rhythm on the gravel. Maxwell followed, Sarah's letter still in his hand, his dark plan receding like a tide, drawing back from shore. But as the house came into view, Maxwell stopped cold. Through the twins' bedroom window, he could see unusual activity. Mrs. Fletcher bent over Emma's bed, Dr. Brennan speaking urgently into a phone, a second nurse preparing an IV. Maxwell ran, heart hammering against his ribs, Sarah's letter fluttering forgotten to the ground behind him. By the time he reached the east wing, an ambulance was already pulling into the circular drive, its lights pulsing silently against the limestone facade of the mansion. "What's happening?" he demanded, bursting into the twins' room. Dr. Brennan looked up, his face grave. "Emma's taken a turn. Her oxygen levels are dropping rapidly. Elijah's holding steady for now, but we need to get them both to the hospital immediately." Maxwell stood frozen, watching as the paramedics transferred his daughter to a stretcher, her small body almost lost under a tangle of tubes and wires. Elijah reached out from his bed, his fingers barely grazing his sister's arm as she was wheeled past. "Daddy," Elijah's voice was thin with fear. "Is Emma going to the angels like Mom?" Maxwell moved to his son's side, gathering the boy's frail body in his arms. "No," he said fiercely, "not if I have anything to say about it. We're fighters in this family, remember? All of us." As they loaded both children into the ambulance, Maxwell caught a glimpse of Paladin standing perfectly still in the courtyard, watching. In the red pulse of the ambulance lights, the horse's white coat seemed to glow from within, a beacon in the Kentucky night. "I'll meet you at the hospital," Maxwell told Mrs. Fletcher. "There's something I need to get first." He raced back to where he'd dropped Sarah's letter, snatching it from the damp ground. Then, acting on an impulse he couldn't explain, he returned to the stable and the old steamer trunk. He gathered the twins' riding equipment, the helmet, the boots, the blue vests, and placed them carefully in a duffel bag, along with a few of their favorite books and toys from the tack room shelves where they'd left them. These weren't just possessions. They were tangible reminders of who his children were beyond their illness, of the joy they had known and would know again. As Maxwell hurried to his car, bag in hand, he passed Paladin one last time. "Watch over the place. Old friend," he said, reaching out to touch the horse's velvety muzzle. "We'll be home before you know it." Paladin nudged Maxwell's shoulder, then stepped back, watching as the man climbed into his car and sped down the long driveway. In the rearview mirror, the white horse was still visible, a solitary guardian. In the spreading dawn, the fluorescent lights of Kentucky Children's Hospital cast everyone in a sickly pallor that made it impossible to tell the visitors from the patients. Maxwell had spent 3 days in the same clothes, sleeping upright in a vinyl chair between the twins' beds, leaving only when forced to by nurses who insisted he eat something, or at least wash his face. Emma had stabilized, but remained unconscious, her small body connected to more machines than Maxwell could identify. Elijah, in the adjacent bed, drifted in and out of sleep, his periods of wakefulness growing shorter each day. The twins had always shared an inexplicable connection. When one felt pain, the other would wince. When one laughed, the other would smile without knowing why. Now they seemed to be fading in tandem, despite the different progression of their illness. "Mr. Hawthorne," a gentle voice pulled Maxwell from his exhausted stupor. Dr. Rivera, the pediatric specialist, stood in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Could we speak in the hallway?" Maxwell followed her out, legs stiff from sitting too long. Through the window of the room, he could see Elijah's thin hand reaching toward his sister's bed, falling just short of contact. "I've consulted with Dr. Brennan and reviewed all their tests," Dr. Rivera began, her voice low and measured. "The disease has progressed further than we'd hoped. Emma's respiratory system is beginning to fail, and Elijah's isn't far behind." Maxwell leaned against the wall, the words hitting him like physical blows. "What options do we have left?" Dr. Rivera hesitated. "There's an experimental treatment being developed at Mass General. It's shown promising results in similar cases. But Desage," she paused, "it's not covered by any insurance. The cost would be substantial." "How substantial?" "The treatment itself runs close to $1 million per patient. Then there's the Medivac transport to Boston, extended hospital stay, follow-up care." Maxwell didn't flinch. "Get them on the list, I'll find the money." Dr. Rivera's expression softened with sympathy. "Mr. Hawthorne, I know you've already liquidated most of your assets for their care. The hospital's financial counselor mentioned you're approaching the limit of what most people could." "I said I'll find the money," Maxwell interrupted, his voice harder than he intended. "What's the timeline?" "If we're going to try this, it needs to be within the next 48 hours. I'll make the calls right away." When she left, Maxwell slumped against the wall, mind racing. He had already sold most of his thoroughbreds, mortgaged the estate to its limit, cashed out every investment. What remained was the land itself, 300 acres of prime Kentucky bluegrass that had been in his wife's family for generations. And Paladin, the last of his champion bloodline. Maxwell pulled out his phone and called Frank Leary, his longtime friend and real estate developer who had been trying to buy the Hawthorne estate for years to build an exclusive golf community. "Frank, it's Maxwell. I'm ready to sell." His voice sounded strange to his own ears, detached and hollow. "All of it. The house, the land, the remaining horses." There was a pause on the line. "Max, you don't mean that. That land is your family's legacy." "My family's legacy is lying in hospital beds right now," Maxwell said sharply. "The land means nothing without them." Another pause. All right, I'll draw up the papers and have my accountant wire you an advance. Will 5 million be enough to start? It'll have to be. I need it by tomorrow. After ending the call, Maxwell returned to the twins' room, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. The Hawthorne estate had been Sarah's pride, the place where 5 generations of her family had lived and worked. She had made him promise to preserve it for the twins, but what good was land or legacy if the twins weren't there to inherit it? Elijah stirred as Maxwell sat beside him. "Dad?" he mumbled, eyes barely opening. "I had a dream about Paladin." Maxwell leaned closer. "What was it, buddy?" "He was trying to show us something important." Elijah's voice was faint, as if coming from a great distance. "At the lake. Emma saw it too." Maxwell glanced at his daughter, still unconscious, monitors beeping steadily beside her. "Emma's sleeping, Elijah." But Elijah shook his head slightly. "Not here. In the dream. We were both there. Paladin was trying to save something. Someone." His words trailed off as he drifted back to sleep. Maxwell sat back, unnerved. The lake, the very place he had considered for his desperate plan. Had the children somehow sensed his dark thoughts, or was this just the rambling of a fevered mind? The next 36 hours passed in a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and quiet vigils by the twins' bedsides. Frank Leary's advance cleared, and arrangements were made for the twins to be transported to Boston the following morning. Dr. Rivera had warned that the experimental treatment was a long shot, but Maxwell clung to it like a drowning man to driftwood. Late. That night, with Mrs. Fletcher dozing in a chair and the hospital corridor quiet, except for the occasional squeak of rubber-soled shoes, Maxwell stepped outside for a moment of fresh air. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty, the October air crisp with the promise of frost. Above, stars pierced the velvet darkness, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding below. Maxwell's phone buzzed with a text from his estate manager. Paladin broke out of the paddock again, found him by the lake, secured now but agitated. Something about the message sent a chill through Maxwell. The lake again. The horse had never shown interest in that part of the property before. What was drawing him there? A sudden impulse seized Maxwell. He needed to go home, to see the estate one last time before signing it away forever. And he needed to check on Paladin to make sure the old champion was all right. He sent a quick text to Mrs. Fletcher explaining his absence, promising to return before dawn when the medevac team would arrive. The drive back to the estate took almost an hour, the winding country roads deserted at this late hour. As Maxwell turned onto the long gravel driveway, the security lights illuminated the limestone facade of the mansion, the weeping willows that lined the approach, the stables where champions had been born and raised. All of it would soon belong to someone else. Instead of going to the house, Maxwell drove directly to the stables. He found Paladin in his stall, pacing restlessly, his white coat gleaming like silver in the dim light. When the horse saw Maxwell, he stopped and fixed him with a stare that seemed too knowing, too intense for an animal. "It's all right, old friend," Maxwell said softly, approaching the stall. "Everything's going to be all right." But as he reached to stroke the horse's neck, Paladin backed away, snorting and tossing his head. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, the horse pushed past Maxwell and bolted from the stable, hooves thundering on the packed earth. "Paladin!" Maxwell shouted, running after him, but the horse was already a pale streak in the darkness, heading toward the southern edge of the property, toward the lake. Maxwell followed, first on foot, then returning for his car when he realized the distance. He drove down the rarely used service road that led to the lake, headlights cutting through the darkness, mind racing with questions. What had gotten into the horse? Why this fixation on the lake? When the road ended, Maxwell continued on foot, guided by moonlight and memory. The lake appeared before him, its surface a mirror reflecting the star-strewn sky, and there was Paladin, standing at the water's edge, motionless as a statue. "What are you doing out here, boy?" Maxwell asked, approaching slowly to avoid startling the horse. Paladin didn't move, his gaze fixed on something in the water. Maxwell followed the horse's line of sight and froze. There, bobbing gently about 20 yards from shore, was the old wooden canoe that had been stored in the boathouse. And in it, barely visible in the moonlight, were two small figures. Maxwell's heart stopped. It was impossible. The twins were in the hospital miles away, yet there was no mistaking the silhouettes. Two small bodies, motionless in the drifting. "Canoe! Emma! Elijah!" he screamed, already wading into the frigid water. But before he could dive in, a hand grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back. "They're not real, Mr. Hawthorne," said a voice behind him. Maxwell whirled to find Thomas Bailey, the elderly groundskeeper who had worked the estate since before Maxwell was born. "It's the mist playing tricks. Look again." Maxwell turned back to the lake. The old man was right. What he had thought was a canoe was merely a fallen log, the figures nothing more than twisted branches. The moonlight and fog had created a perfect illusion of his darkest fear. "I don't understand," Maxwell said, his voice shaking. "Why am I seeing things?" Thomas shook his head, his weathered face solemn in the moonlight. "Perhaps it's not what you're seeing, but what you're being shown." He nodded toward Paladin, who still stood at the water's edge. "That horse has been trying to tell you something for days." "Tell me what?" Maxwell demanded, frustration building. "He's an animal, Thomas, not a prophet." "Animals sense things we don't," Thomas said simply. "My grandmother used to say that. White animals especially walk between worlds. They see what's coming before we do." Maxwell ran a hand over his face, exhaustion and stress making it hard to think clearly. "The twins are dying, Thomas. I'm selling the estate to pay for a treatment that probably won't even work. What could Paladin possibly be trying to tell me that would change any of that?" Thomas didn't answer directly. Instead, he pointed to something, half buried in the mud at the lake's edge. The old steamer trunk that Maxwell had found in the stable, the one that had contained Sarah's letter. It was open, its contents, the twins' riding gear, books and toys, scattered around it. "How did this get here?" Maxwell asked, kneeling to gather the muddied items. "Found it here this morning," Thomas said. "Thought maybe you'd brought it down. There was a letter too, looked like your late wife's handwriting, but the wind took it before I could catch it." Maxwell's mind reeled. He had left the trunk in the stable after retrieving Sarah's letter and packing the twins' things for the hospital. How had it ended up here, at the exact spot where he had contemplated his desperate plan? As if in answer, Paladin approached, nudging Maxwell's shoulder with his muzzle. The horse's dark eyes seemed to hold a message, a silent understanding, that transcended the barrier between human and animal. "He's been standing guard over that trunk all day," Thomas said. "Wouldn't let anyone near it, not even me." Maxwell looked from the trunk to the horse, a realization dawning slowly. Paladin had always been protective of the twins, had always seemed to sense when they needed guarding. What if the horse had somehow sensed Maxwell's darkest thoughts and was trying, in the only way he could, to prevent a tragedy? The lake, the canoe, the trunk with its precious memories. It was as if the horse was holding up a mirror to Maxwell's soul, showing him the path he had nearly taken and offering him a different one. "I need to get back to the hospital," Maxwell said suddenly, gathering the twins' belongings and placing them carefully back in the trunk. "Can you get this dried out and bring it to me there, and make sure Paladin is properly secured this time?" Thomas nodded, his eyes knowing. "You've seen it now, haven't you? What he's been trying to show you?" Maxwell didn't answer. He was already running back to his car, a new urgency in his steps. The weight that had been crushing him for months felt lighter somehow, as if a toxic burden had been purged from his system. As he drove back toward the hospital, Dawn was breaking over the Kentucky hills, painting the landscape in hues of gold and rose. Maxwell found himself speaking aloud, first to Sarah, then to God, then to whatever forces might be listening in the universe. "I understand now," he said, his voice steadying with each word. "I was looking at this all wrong. It's not about fixing everything or taking control. It's about being there, being present for however long we have." He thought of the items in the trunk, not just possessions, but touchstones of the twins' identities, reminders of who they were beyond their illness. He thought of Sarah's letter, of her faith in his strength as a father. And he thought of Paladin, the silent guardian who had somehow known exactly what Maxwell needed to see. By the time he reached the hospital, a plan had formed in his mind. Not a plan of desperation, but one of hope. If the experimental treatment in Boston didn't work, he would find another, and another after that. And if in the end, nothing could save his children, he would ensure that their remaining time was filled with love and meaning, not fear and isolation. The hospital was already stirring with the activity of shift change when Maxwell arrived. He took the elevator to the pediatric floor, his heart lighter than it had been in months. But as the doors opened, he was met by the sight of Dr. Rivera running toward the twins' room, followed by a crash team pushing a cart of emergency equipment. "What's happening?" Maxwell called, breaking into a run. Dr. Rivera turned, her face grave. "It's Emma. Her heart has stopped. We're doing everything we can." Maxwell staggered, the world tilting beneath his feet. After everything, the realization at the lake, the renewed hope, the plans for a different approach. Was he too late? Had his temporary absence cost him his daughter's life? He stood in the doorway, watching as the medical team worked frantically over Emma's small form, the rhythm of chest compressions punctuated by the mechanical voice of the defibrillator. From the other bed, Elijah watched with wide, terrified eyes, his own monitors beeping in accelerated patterns that matched his fear. "Daddy," Elijah called, his voice barely audible over the commotion. "Is Emma going away?" Maxwell moved to his son's side, taking the boy's hand in his. "No," he said, with a certainty he didn't feel. "She's fighting. We're all fighting." As he spoke, Maxwell became aware of something clutched in Elijah's other hand, a small white feather like those that sometimes clung to Paladin's mane. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "It was here when I woke up," Elijah whispered. "I think Paladin sent it for Emma." Before Maxwell could respond, Dr. Rivera's voice cut through the chaos. "We have a pulse. She's back." The room seemed to exhale collectively. Maxwell looked from Elijah to Emma, then down at the white feather in his son's hand. It was impossible, of course. The hospital was miles from the estate, and Paladin was just a horse, not some mystical being. And yet, as the emergency team stabilized Emma and the crisis passed, Maxwell couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary had occurred, that somehow, across the distance, Paladin was still standing guard over the twins, still fighting to protect them in his own mysterious way. "Mr. Hawthorne?" Dr. Rivera approached, her face showing both relief and concern. "We've stabilized Emma for now, but this only underscores the urgency of getting them to Boston. The medevac team will be here within the hour." Maxwell nodded, his resolve strengthening. "We'll be ready. And, Doctor, I want to try something different while we wait." At his request, the hospital staff moved the twins' beds closer together, allowing Elijah to reach out and take his sister's hand. Maxwell placed the white feather between their joined hands, then opened the duffel bag he'd brought from home. He took out the twins' favorite books and began to read aloud. Stories of adventure and courage, of friendship and magic, of challenges overcome and worlds saved. As he read, Emma's eyes fluttered open for the first time in days. She didn't speak, but her fingers tightened around Elijah's, and a ghost of a smile touched her lips. Elijah, too, seemed strengthened by the connection, his breathing easier, his eyes more alert. Outside the hospital window, the sun climbed higher in the Kentucky sky, bathing the room in golden light. And miles away, at the Hawthorne estate, a white horse stood at the fence line, facing east toward the city, his posture alert and watchful, a silent sentinel keeping guard over the children he loved. 6 months later, the Kentucky spring unfurled. Across the Hawthorne estate in waves of green and gold, dogwoods bloomed along the driveway, their white flowers like clouds brought down to earth. In the pastures, new foals wobbled on spindly legs beside their mothers, their coats gleaming in the April sunshine. Maxwell stood on the front porch, coffee cooling in his forgotten cup as he watched the school bus make its way up the long drive. When it stopped, the doors opened with a hydraulic sigh, and 2 small figures descended the steps, slowly, carefully, but under their own power. "Dad!" Emma called, her voice stronger than it had been in over a year. "Ms. Thompson gave me an A on my science project." Beside her, Elijah moved with the deliberate steps of someone still getting used to his own body again. "And I got to play kickball at recess," he added. "Just for a little while, but still." Maxwell set down his cup and opened his arms. The twins rushed to him, not with the boundless energy they'd had before their illness, but with a joy that was all the more precious for what they'd overcome. "That's amazing," he said, embracing them both. "How about we celebrate with a ride? Paladin's been waiting all day." The twins' faces lit up. Though they still had weekly checkups and monthly visits to Boston, their improvement since the experimental treatment had been nothing short of miraculous. The road to recovery stretched long ahead, with no guarantees, but each day brought small victories that accumulated like the spring blossoms dotting the hillsides. "Can we have a picnic by the lake after?" Emma asked, already heading for the stables. Maxwell felt a momentary tightness in his chest at the mention of the lake. That place that had once represented his darkest despair now transformed into a spot of simple family pleasure. "Absolutely," he agreed. "Mrs. Potter packed a basket this morning. It's waiting in the kitchen." As they approached the stables, a familiar whinny greeted them. Paladin stood at his paddock gate, his white coat luminous against the green pasture beyond. The horse had changed too over the past months, more settled, less prone to breaking out of his enclosure, as if some mysterious mission had been completed. Thomas Bailey was brushing down one of the yearlings nearby. He tipped his hat to the twins, a smile crinkling his weathered face. "Those riding lessons are paying off," he observed. "You two are sitting taller every day." "Dr. Rivera says the physical therapy is building our muscles back," Elijah explained. "Seriously. And riding helps with our balance and core strength. Is that so?" Thomas winked at Maxwell over the children's heads. "And here, I thought you just liked spending time with that ornery old stallion." Emma approached Paladin's paddock, the horse lowering his proud head to meet her outstretched hand. "He's not ornery," she protested. "He's wise. Dad says he's the reason we got better." "Your dad might be right about that," Thomas said, his voice softening, "more right than he knows." Maxwell had never fully explained to the twins how close he'd come to the unthinkable that night by the lake, or how Paladin's strange behavior had jolted him back to himself. Some burdens weren't meant for children's shoulders, but he had told them about Sarah's letter, about the trunk full of memories, and about the white feather that had appeared in Elijah's hand at the hospital. All pieces of a puzzle that had somehow led them here, to this season of recovery. While Maxwell and Thomas saddled Paladin, the twins explored the stable, checking on their favorite foals and leaving carrot treats in strategic locations. Their movements were still slower than before, their frames thinner, but life had returned to their eyes. that spark of childhood resilience that had nearly been extinguished. "Never seen anything like it," Thomas murmured as he adjusted the girth on Paladin's saddle. "Those doctors in Boston said it was the treatment, but I know better." "The treatment certainly helped," Maxwell acknowledged. He had the medical reports to prove it, detailed charts showing the gradual retreat of the disease that had nearly claimed his children. Thomas snorted softly. "Oh, I don't doubt that fancy medicine did its part, but there was something else at work too." He nodded toward Paladin. "That horse never left the fence line the whole time the twins were in Boston. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep properly. Just stood there watching the eastern horizon like he was keeping some kind of vigil." Maxwell had heard this before. From Thomas, from the stable hands, from Mrs. Potter, who had brought blankets out to cover the horse on the coldest nights. He didn't know what to make of it, just as he didn't know how to explain the white feather that had appeared in Elijah's hospital bed, or the dreams both twins had reported of Paladin standing guard over them during their treatment. Some mysteries, he had decided, were best left unexplored. What mattered was that his children were here, improving day by day, their laughter once again filling the spaces that had been hollowed out by grief and fear. "We're ready," Emma announced, returning with her brother. Both wore their riding helmets, Emma's adorned with butterfly stickers, Elijah's with the dinosaur decal that had somehow survived everything. Maxwell lifted them onto Paladin's back, one at a time, making sure they were securely seated. Though they'd ridden double on the horse since infancy, he was still cautious, still acutely aware of their fragility. "I'll lead him today," he said, taking the reins. "Nice and easy around the north pasture, then down to the lake for our picnic." Thomas watched them go, a knowing look in his eyes. "You made the right choice," he called after Maxwell. "Keeping the estate, keeping that horse. Some things aren't meant to be given up, no matter how dark the hour." Maxwell raised a hand in acknowledgement but didn't turn. Thomas didn't know all the details. How Frank Leary had torn up the sale agreement the moment he'd heard about the twins' improvement, how the experimental treatment had been fully funded by an anonymous donor who Maxwell suspected was one of his competitors in the racing world, or how the twins' recovery had inspired a foundation dedicated to researching their rare disease. The north pasture was alive with spring activity, mares and foals grazing on the sweet new grass, birds darting among the ancient oaks that dotted the landscape. Maxwell led Paladin at a gentle walk, alert to every shift of the twins on the horse's back, every sound of delight or wonder they made at the world reawakening around them. "Dad, look!" Elijah pointed to a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. "Ms. Abernathy says hawks are messengers in some cultures, like Paladin with his white feather." Emma leaned forward to stroke the horse's neck. "Do you think Mom knows we're better?" she asked quietly. Maxwell's throat tightened. "I think she does," he managed. "I think she's been watching over you both all along." The path to the lake wound through a small copse of willows, their trailing branches creating a green tunnel that dappled the sunlight. When they emerged, the water stretched before them, its surface glittering like scattered diamonds under the midday sun. Maxwell helped the twins dismount and tied Paladin to a low branch where the horse could graze comfortably. From his saddlebag, he removed the picnic blanket and spread it on a grassy spot overlooking the water. "I'll get the basket from the boathouse," he said. "You two rest for a bit." The small boathouse at the edge of the lake had been renovated in recent months. No longer the musty, cobwebbed space it had once been, but a cheerful structure with windows that let in the light and a small deck where the family sometimes sat to watch the sunset. Maxwell had found that transforming the physical spaces associated with his darkest thoughts helped to transform the thoughts themselves. Inside, the picnic basket waited on a shelf alongside, fishing rods and life jackets sized for the twins. The old wooden canoe hung from the ceiling, newly restored and varnished to a honey glow. Maxwell took it down sometimes, paddling across the lake with one or both twins, reclaiming the water as a place of joy rather than despair. As he retrieved the basket, Maxwell noticed a small white feather on the floor near the door. He picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. Paladin was shedding his winter coat, leaving tufts of white hair on fences and bushes throughout the property. But this was a true feather, like the one that had appeared in the hospital. Maxwell slipped it into his pocket and returned to the picnic spot, where he found Emma and Elijah lying on their backs on the blanket, pointing out cloud shapes to each other. Paladin grazed nearby, occasionally raising his head to check on the twins, his dark eyes alert in his pale face. "Lunch is served," Maxwell announced, unpacking sandwiches, fruit, and the oatmeal cookies that had become a post-hospital favorite. "And after we eat, I have a surprise for you both." The twins sat up eagerly. "What kind of surprise?" Elijah asked, accepting a sandwich. "The best kind," Maxwell said, smiling at their anticipation. "But first, I want to hear all about school today. Every detail." As they ate, the twins took turns describing their day. Emma's science project on photosynthesis, Elijah's triumph at kickball, the new student who had moved from California and thought their Kentucky accents were totally cool. Maxwell listened, savoring every word, every gesture, every sign of their gradual return to normal childhood. When the meal was finished and the remnants packed away, Maxwell reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew 2 small velvet boxes. "These are for you," he said, handing one to each twin, "to celebrate 6 months of fighting the good fight." Emma opened hers first, gasping at the silver pendant inside, a delicate horse charm on a fine chain. "It looks just like Paladin," she exclaimed, immediately putting it on. Elijah's box contained a similar pendant, slightly more masculine in design. "This is awesome, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion that belied his years. "I'm never taking it off." "They're more than just necklaces," Maxwell explained. "Each one has a tiny compartment inside." He showed them how to open the horse's back, revealing a minute space within. "I put something special in each one." Emma peered into her pendant, then carefully tipped the contents into her palm. A tiny white feather, no larger than her smallest fingernail. Elijah found the same in his Suitcase from Paladin, he asked, looking up at his father with wonder. Maxwell nodded. "To remind you that you're never alone, even when it feels that way. That there's always someone watching over you, fighting alongside you." The twins exchanged glances, one of those silent communications that had deepened during their illness. Then, without a word, they moved to embrace Maxwell, their arms thin but strong around his neck. "We know, Dad," Emma whispered. "We've always known." For a moment, the 3 of them stayed locked in the embrace, the spring breeze ruffling their hair, the lake murmuring at the shore beside them. Maxwell closed his eyes, overwhelmed by gratitude for this second chance, this reprieve that had seemed impossible in his darkest hour. A soft nickering broke the silence. Paladin had approached and now stood beside them, his muzzle gently nudging Maxwell's shoulder, as if reminding him of something important. "You're right," Maxwell said, straightening up. "The day's not over yet. Who's ready for a proper ride?" The twins' faces lit up. This was what they had been waiting for. Not just the short walk from the stables, but a real ride across the fields like they used to take before their illness. Dr. Rivera had finally given permission, provided they didn't go too fast or too far and didn't overtire themselves. Maxwell untied Paladin and helped the twins remount, this time swinging up behind them. With Elijah in front, Emma in the middle, and Maxwell at the back, they set off at a walking pace, following the lakeshore before turning toward the open fields beyond. "Can we go faster?" Elijah asked as they reached a long, flat stretch of pasture. Maxwell hesitated, then relented. "Just a gentle trot," he agreed. "Hold on tight to the mane." He clicked his tongue, and Paladin responded immediately, picking up his pace to a smooth trot that bounced the twins in the saddle. Their laughter rose into the spring air, mingling with the sound of hoofbeats on the soft earth. Maxwell kept one arm wrapped around Emma, the other on the reins, his body a protective shell around his children. As they crested a small rise overlooking the estate, Maxwell drew Paladin to a halt. From this vantage point, they could see the whole of the Hawthorne property, the white-fenced paddocks where champion thoroughbreds grazed, the training track where future winners would learn their craft, the limestone mansion that had been in Sarah's family for generations. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice catching. "This is your heritage, your home, and it always will be." Emma leaned back against him. "Mum would be happy we're all still here," she said with the simple certainty of childhood. "She would," Maxwell agreed, thinking of Sarah's letter, of her faith in his strength as a father. "She is." They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the view, the horse standing patient beneath them. Then, from the direction of the stables came the sound of a vehicle approaching, Thomas's old pickup truck making its way up the hill toward them. "Visitors," Elijah announced as the truck drew closer. Maxwell recognized the passenger even before the truck stopped. Dr. Rivera, who had made the trip from Lexington for the twins' weekly checkup. Beside her sat another figure that made Maxwell's heart skip a beat, Frank Leary, the developer who had nearly purchased the estate. "What are they doing here?" Emma asked as Thomas parked and the visitors climbed out. "Let's find out," Maxwell said, dismounting and helping the twins down. Paladin stayed close, watching the newcomers with alert interest. Dr. Rivera approached first, her professional demeanor softening as she saw the twins' flushed, happy faces. "I see someone's been enjoying the spring weather," she observed. "How are you feeling? Any fatigue, shortness of breath?" "We're great," Elijah assured her. "Dad let us trot." "Did he now?" Dr. Rivera raised an eyebrow at Maxwell, but her smile indicated approval. "Well, your last tests were very encouraging. I don't think a little trotting will hurt." Frank Leary hung back, hands in the pockets of his expensive suit, looking oddly out of place in the pastoral setting. Maxwell walked over to him, extending a hand. "Frank, this is a surprise." The developer shook his hand firmly. "Sorry to interrupt your family time. Thomas mentioned you were out riding, but Dr. Rivera wanted to share some news, and I have a proposition that wouldn't wait." Before Maxwell could respond, Dr. Rivera called him over to where she was examining the twins. Her stethoscope moved, from Emma's chest to Elijah's, her expression growing more pleased with each passing moment. "Their lung function is remarkably improved," she said when she'd finished. "Heart rate strong and steady. I'd say they're progressing faster than any of us expected." "Does that mean we can go back to school full-time?" Emma asked eagerly. The twins had been attending on a limited schedule, just mornings for now, with a tutor coming to the estate in the afternoons. Dr. Rivera considered this. "Let's try 5 hours a day next week and see how it goes. If that works out, maybe full days the week after. No extracurriculars yet, though." The twins exchanged excited glances. "Can we ride Paladin every day?" Elijah asked. "As long as someone's with you and you don't overdo it," Dr. Rivera conceded. "In fact, I think the riding therapy has been a significant factor in your recovery. The physical benefits are clear, but there's something else too." She glanced at the white horse, who stood nearby, ears pricked forward as if listening to the conversation, a connection that seems to strengthen you both. Paladin's our guardian, Emma said matter-of-factly. He kept us safe when we were sick, and he's helping us get strong again. Dr. Rivera didn't dismiss this as childish fantasy, as Maxwell might have expected. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. I've seen enough in my career to know that healing often involves forces we don't fully understand. Whatever the connection is, it's working. She turned to Maxwell, lowering her voice. The team in Boston is amazed by their progress. They want to publish a paper on the twins' case, with your permission, of course. It could help other children with the same condition. Maxwell felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, hope, and lingering traces of the fear that had nearly consumed him. And, of course, anything that might help other families avoid what we went through. Frank Leary approached then, having apparently overheard. That's actually related to why I'm here, he said. Maxwell, I know we've had our differences, especially when I was trying to buy this place out from under you. But what your family has gone through, what those kids have overcome, it's made me rethink some priorities. Maxwell waited, unsure where this was heading. Frank was a businessman to his core, not given to sentimentality or sudden changes of heart. I've been talking with some investors, Frank continued. People who were interested in the golf community I had planned. I've convinced them to put their money into something else instead. A pediatric research center specializing in rare childhood diseases like the one the twins had. A research center? Maxwell repeated, caught off guard. Frank nodded. Right here in Kentucky, we've already secured land near the university, and we're in talks with some top specialists from around the country. But we need a local face for the project, someone who understands the mission on a personal level. He met Maxwell's gaze directly. I want you to be the director. Maxwell stared at him, speechless. Of all the things he had expected Frank to say, this wasn't even on the list. I don't have a medical background, he protested finally. I breed horses, Frank. I wouldn't know the first thing about running a research center. You wouldn't handle the medical side. We'll have a chief of medicine for that. You'd be the public face, the fundraiser, the advocate. You'd share your family's story to inspire donors and give hope to other parents. Frank glanced at the twins, who were showing Dr. Rivera their new pendants. No one could do it better than you. Thomas, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. He's right, Max. You've always had a way with people, and now you've got a purpose that's bigger than just business. It's a calling. Maxwell looked from Thomas to Frank, then to his children laughing in the spring sunshine, their silver pendants, catching the light. He thought of the desperate father he had been 6 months ago, standing at the edge of this very lake with darkness in his heart. How many other parents were at that edge right now, with no white horse to guide them back, no letter from a departed loved one to remind them of their strength. I'll need to think about it, he said finally. Discuss it with the twins. Our lives are just getting back to normal. Frank nodded. Take all the time you need. The offer stands. He handed Maxwell a thick envelope. Here's the preliminary proposal, budget projections, everything you need to make an informed decision. And Maxwell, whatever you decide, I'm glad things worked out the way they did. This place, he gestured to the rolling hills of the estate, it's where you belong, all of you. As Frank and Dr. Rivera prepared to leave, promising to return the following week for the twins' next checkup, Emma and Elijah ran to Maxwell's side. What were you talking about, Dad? Emma asked, slipping her hand into his. You looked serious. Maxwell knelt to their level, taking one small hand in each of his. Mr. Leary has offered me a job, he explained, running a special place that would help other children who are sick like you were. The shore. Twins considered this solemnly. Would you have to leave us? Elijah asked, a trace of fear in his voice. Never, Maxwell assured him. "We'd stay right here on the estate. I'd just be working in the city sometimes, telling your story to help." "Other families?" Emma's face brightened. "Our story, about how we got sick and you took care of us, and Paladin watched over us and then we got better." "Exactly that story," Maxwell confirmed. "But I won't take the job unless you both think it's a good idea. We're a team, remember? We make big decisions together." The twins exchanged one of their silent communications, then turned back to him with matching expressions of certainty. "You should do it, Dad," Elijah said firmly, "so other kids can get better like we did. And other dads don't have to be sad like you were," Emma added, her insight piercing Maxwell's heart. He pulled them both into a tight embrace, overwhelmed by their compassion, their resilience, their simple wisdom. "When did you two get so grown up?" he murmured into their hair. "When we were sick," Emma answered matter-of-factly. "But we're still kids, Dad. We still need you to push us on the swings and read us stories and lead Paladin when we ride." "And that," Maxwell promised, "is exactly what I'll do." As the visitors drove away and Thomas returned to the stables, the Hawthorne family remained on the hillside, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. Maxwell helped the twins back onto Paladin's broad back, then mounted behind them. Together, they rode slowly toward home, following the path that wound through blooming dogwoods and past the lake that had once represented despair, but now reflected only sky and hope. Paladin moved with steady confidence, carrying his precious cargo with the dignity of a guardian who had fulfilled his sacred duty. And as they approached the stables, where lamps were beginning to glow against the gathering dusk, Maxwell felt Sarah's presence more strongly than he had since her passing, not as a ghost or a visitation, but as a continuous thread of love and guidance that had been there all along, even in his darkest hour. "We're home," he said to the twins, to the horse, to the spring twilight, to whatever forces had conspired to bring them all safely to this moment of grace. Emma reached up to touch her silver pendant. "We never really left," she said softly. "Even when we were sick, home was always here, waiting for us." Elijah nodded, in agreement, his hand covering his own pendant. "And it always will be, right, Dad? No matter what happens?" "Always," Maxwell promised, knowing with bone-deep certainty that it was true. Whatever challenges lay ahead, for the twins' health, for his new role, for the estate itself, they would face them together, strengthened by what they had already overcome. As if confirming this covenant, Paladin tossed his white head and quickened his pace for the final stretch of pathway. The last rays of sunset caught his pale coat, illuminating him like a beacon against the deepening blue of evening, a silent guardian leading his family home. Dear listeners, we hope that Maxwell and the twins' journey alongside their faithful guardian Paladin has touched your heart today. Stories like these remind us that even in our darkest moments, hope can appear in the most unexpected forms, sometimes in the watchful eyes of a silent protector who sees more than we realize. If you found yourself moved by the bond between the Hawthorne family and their remarkable white horse, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of resilience, redemption, and the unbreakable connections between humans and animals. Hit the like button to help others discover this story, and share in the comments which moment brought tears to your eyes or reminded you of your own guardian angels. Remember, every week we bring you new stories that celebrate the triumph of love over despair and the healing power of connection. Don't miss our next episode, where another extraordinary tale awaits. Because sometimes the most profound guardians in our lives don't speak a word. They simply stand beside us, unwavering, in their loyalty, until we find our way back to the light.